Okay, but while we're at it, let's define reason in a way that reasonable can actually be used to describe, let's say, a human brain. Human brains are capable of having these sort of objectives or values. So these mechanisms that we'd classify as objectives or values that um, vote in the mental system and in the behavioral output selection process. To be reasonable is not to be able to treat all information correctly. To be reasonable, we can define as to want to. And if we throw empiricism in there, how we get information and our reliance on objective or optimally objective measure, maybe we could phrase being reasonable as having a good, quote unquote, or justified, maybe, confidence to evidence ratio. Or if we want to leave out empiricism, so leave out evidence, we want to just talk about reason, then we could look at the confidence to, or we could just look at the confidence percentage, how certain someone is. Anybody who's over, no, okay, we can look at the confidence to importance of logical principles ratio, in which case I would not qualify as reasonable. Although they're important to me, I've not done a good job of learning symbolic logic, propositional logic, the language logement. Planning to do that soon when my partner hits me up again. I would never consider myself reasonable, but I did expect that the definition I was going to come up with would apply to me because I do value evidence and so on. But maybe anybody could say that. I can definitely describe myself as empirical when you look at the ratio of my confidence to evidence. If I were to talk to you about any of these ideas, I'd pull out a stack of about 10 books that are all themselves well reputed, and I would show it to you. And I've mentioned lots of these different books. We were just reading one today, How Minds Change. Maybe I'd be okay there. But anyway, so we can describe, so maybe we could say I'm fairly good at being empirical, at least using the empiricism of others whom I trust or who have been recognized by their community. We can define reasonable as the ratio between confidence and mastery of logical principles. And also frequency of adaptation for both of them, how empirical you are and how reasonable you are. Those also depend on the frequency with which you adapt to, in the empirical case, new information, and in the reasonable case, any sort of counter to the principles that you claim, the reasonable principles that you claim do lead to the conclusion that you had. Even, of course, you know that's not actually how you got to your conclusion. The best thing we can do as human brains is to just go back and check a conclusion. It's hard to reasonably, it's not impossible to reasonably get to a conclusion, but we can sort of, as we're trying to get to a conclusion based on whatever random mechanisms are going, we can sort of limit certain outputs. We can say, no, 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 we know that violates this rule, maybe. I don't know. So to leave off, let's suppose that reasonable is not an ability, but an objective. An objective to stay faithful to the latest, best principles of logic, to evaluate the desire and the willingness, and also the propensity to evaluate ideas based on things of logic, which I do not do at all. I do evaluate my ideas based on evidence, but hey, maybe I'm treating that evidence incorrectly. So that's what we also need to do as humans. We need to learn our, but also, hold on, just one last thing. I define critical thinking, which feels like an associated concept to reason, as being of three parts. One, critical recognition, knowing what your thinking mechanisms are. So I'm a human brain. Information's coming in. There's a whole bunch of stuff already in here. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, and then stuff's coming out. If I know that the stuff coming out isn't just the information reflecting back, reality reflecting back, if I understand that I'm a human brain pre-programmed with all this stuff that isn't necessarily helpful, some of it is, okay, then I have critical recognition, which is a sort of unskippable state. If you ever want to think well, you have to know how the thinking, have some idea of how the thinking machine works, and especially you have to know about some of the errors that the thinking machine often produces as it does its imperfect imitations of reason by sometimes coming to the same answer as what a reasonable calculation would yield. Which is why my confidence tends to be very low about certain things. And in that case, I'm wondering whether I can maybe qualify as being at a noble point on the reasonable spectrum. because I do have critical recognition. The next parts of critical thinking are basically critical reason and critical empiricism. So I call it, instead of critical reason, I call it critical reflection. Instead of critical empiricism, I call it critical research, so that it's CR. Critical recognition, critical reason, and critical reflection and critical research. Critical reflection being, well, I always do reflection first, and then I start and realize, oh wait, you have to do empiricism first. So critical research being acquiring information based on, based on good principles that have proven useful. Science is a pretty darn cool method. You go and measure, you control a bunch of variables, you try to leave it so that there's only one variable that you're testing. You do a control group, you do a group where this variable is modified, and then you see what the results are. That's a pretty cool, the scientific method's pretty cool. So critical research on the front line is often going to be like the scientific method. Critical research a little bit back of house, or no, that metaphor is weird. But not front line is going to be your looking at good sources. You are taking in information that seems to have been evidenced. And then critical reflection is once you have some information that you critically received through your critical research, well, now you critically reflect on it. And what that means is you don't reason in the sense that you perfectly treat all of the information that comes in, but as you're treating it and after you treat it, you are deferring to, or you are considering certain principles of logic that have been discovered. And so you try to catch, oh wait, I'm thinking this premise leads to this premise, but actually, according to this, there's an undistributed middle here. Okay, cool. And there you go. That's critical thinking. Knowing how the thinking machine works first. Ça, c'est la base. Second, getting information not just according to your gut, but according to things that good minds have come up with as, rather than just, oh, my dad said this, so therefore it's true. Well, that's not critical research. That person there has spent 20 years in a lab studying it and has published a bunch of peer-reviewed articles. We cannot say that's fact or sure, but we're better off trusting that source than your dad. And then critical reflection. Your gut's going to drive you real quick to a certain conclusion. You did not evolve the perfect calibrations to treat every piece of evidence. We have come up with some pretty cool ways to treat certain information, and more specifically, or more importantly, we've identified, or more usefully maybe, we've identified certain ways that we mistreat information habitually, systematically. Okay, so then you try to avoid those. Now you're checking all three boxes. I don't know exactly how the brain can get to reliably checking all three boxes, but first I'm just trying to spread some critical recognition among all my early risers, and then eventually, after my passing, the rest of the world.